come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني وجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني وجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع أنا خط خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Не стой, снегопад, не реке верный пока.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 9th of February. We are at 1948 of the evening, and we begin the examination of the interview between Mr. Tucker Carlson and the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. And we are starting earlier tonight because I have to be up very early tomorrow morning in order to go down to, across in actual fact, to the fair city of Liverpool, where I will be attending, or shall we say manning, along with other comrades, the CPGBML stall in a little place called Toxteth. Sefton Park, I believe, is what the locals call the area. So if you're in the area from about midday tomorrow, that's where you'll be able to find me. Maybe you want to come and make a point about the live stream. So we are here today to examine the Putin interview. Before we get started, though, if you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share the stream. I see we've got 62 of you on here already. That's very, very good. We're also live on Odyssey and on Rumble right now. So you can find us on there. So I am just going to do the necessary sharing around of the various different links that need to be shared. I will continue, of course, to narrate things while I do so. If you've got questions regarding the interview between Carlson and Putin yesterday, then be sure to post them in the chat. While I'm just doing the advertising, I will update you on a couple of other things that I am doing. Now, I did say last weekend that I was going to do a program on socialist Romania. That has been delayed due to the fact that I've got a reading list and a to-do list as long as my arms at the moment, so I've had to put a slight delay on that. So I will be back doing that probably next week. Now, what I am going to do on Sunday of this week, or I should say of early next week, is a Q&A show, which will go up first on Patreon. So what I'll be doing is I'll be answering a lot of questions that have come in, and I'll be doing that live on Patreon. Then I'll probably be posting it up later as a video on YouTube. So I've advertised on Telegram, and if you're not a member of the Telegram group as of yet, be sure to join that. It's where there's a lot of very interesting discussion in the chat there throughout the day, and comrades share various different resources which are always very useful to look at. So be sure to join the Telegram group. You can find the details in the description box, along with the details of the Patreon and various other things and other ways you can support the project that we're engaged in, as well of course as the link to the website. So with that in mind, we are ready to go. So let's first of all start by going through the various points that have been made in the chat so far. I'm just going to make sure we can see everything here. Hello. Right. Hello. Hi. Good evening to you. And Muzzle Paint says, Solidarity comrades, I am looking forward to Alex's take on this. Currently, I think this is the best insight into Putin available in Western media and readily available to the masses. I also think Tucker was way out of his league and continuously demonstrated he is a ruling class stooge. Yes, he serves a slightly different section of the ruling class than most of the corporate press in the United States now, but still, he's a ruling class guy, and as Putin rather mischievously pointed out to him, well, you wanted to join the CIA. So you got the feeling that Putin was periodically irritated and amused by Carlson in almost equal measure. Good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Jerry, good evening to you. Slava, good evening to you, or I should say good afternoon. James Graham, Z to you. Pablo Popova, hello to you. Carmo, good evening to you. I can't imagine any of our collective West leaders giving such a controlled and informative interview. Well, not really an interview, as Tucker Carlson, as VP alluded to, also a talk show host. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine Sunak speaking for 2 hours without notes on anything. I can't imagine Keir Starmer doing it either. Macron, maybe. He fancies himself as an intellectual. Doesn't mean he is, of course. So he could probably talk for 2 hours. It just wouldn't make any sense. Schultz, definitely not. Maloney, little bit more about her, but basically a stooge, so wouldn't have anything interesting to say. Biden, forget it. Did you see his performance yesterday? Claiming that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was the president of Mexico. I'm just surprised he didn't start quoting from the Charlton Heston movie, The Ten Commandments. Rob, hello to you, and Beans, hello to you both. Rianne, evening to you. Right, we've also got Will Johnson, Heidi, good evening to you both. Brad Wall, and Gerard Stones, and Peter, who joins us from Perfidious Albion. Paul McCord from over there on Merseyside, good evening to you. Lee Hinchcliffe, good evening to you. Klavek, who says hello from Detroit, good to see you here. And Todd Doherty says, Putin uses the US ruling class's own anti-communism to out anti-communism them when he condemns Stalin and Lenin and says, we're a bourgeois society just like you. You raise an interesting point, Todd, and I'll be coming back to that. Muzzle Paint wishes we could edit the chat. Well, take it up with Google and their funders, DARPA. Georgi, who says, I'm sure you will give me reasons to watch the interview. Well, I'll come to that. Klavek says, Putin learns and grows. Maybe he will evolve into Marxism-Leninism. He sure got an education in imperialism. Again, I will come back to that. Hello to Yu Wan, who's joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. Otis19450 says, a very good evening to comrades from the Democratic People's Republic of Northumberland. You've expanded it from Newcastle upon Tyne. Your war against capitalism is going even better. I didn't realise that the rule of the popular masses had taken all of historic Northumberland. We've really got to up our game here in historic Lancashire. If we can, I'm going to set up a 5-year plan. If me and the Scouse comrades can set up a Democratic People's Republic of historic Lancashire, stretching from, we may need to claim the Wirral, there may need to be a special military operation there just to make sure we've got full control over the entrance to the Mersey, but I reckon full control over historic Lancashire with possible annexation of the Wirral by 2029 is not an unreasonable point. We will be forming a united front government, so please send your applications into the regular email address if you'd like to be considered. Right. Guy Schuller, good evening to you, or I think you are our Brazilian friend, so I should be saying probably good afternoon to you. Stanislav Tomov says, good evening from Bulgaria. Good to see a Bulgarian comrade joining us. 2 excellent books about Milosevic and Srebrenica by the Dutch author Germinal Sivikov, who's of Bulgarian origin. Srebrenica, the Key Witness, and the Milosevic Process, Report of a Witness. Both very interesting, Stanislav. I take it, are those available in English? I mean, we could run them through a translator now. Because, yeah, the Yugoslav war, I mean, we've commented on this before. Putin mentions it in the interview, of course. He mentions it a lot, especially the Kosovo side of things. And I think if you want to understand everything that's happened since 1991, or perhaps before, understanding the reality of the breakup of Yugoslavia, I think will help you understand everything that's happened since then. So, and of course, the key book, or one of the key books to understanding it, is, of course, Parenti's book on the Kosovo War and the breakup of Yugoslavia. So get your hands on that if you haven't already. Guy says, oh no, we've jumped too far ahead. Hang on. We've got Muzzle Paint asks, when is the US tour happening? Interesting point. I haven't set foot in your fair nation since the summer of 1997, when I was all of 15 years old. I do need to go back. So to be continued, I think. Perhaps towards the end of this year, if I can put aside enough money. I'll keep you posted. Cortez, what's up from Sofia, Bulgaria? Another Bulgarian friend joining us. Stanislav says, from the summary on the cover of the first one, the credibility of the Tribunal for Yugoslavia will be shaken to the core after reading this book. The fallacies and manipulations of a thoroughly political process become apparent. Sadly, both are published in German and haven't been translated to English. Not a problem. I can read German. So what I'll do is, on your recommendation, Stanislav, I'll try and get hold of copies of those that I can run through. What I'll do is I'll run it through an auto translate, and then I will correct it manually, because my German comprehension is good enough reading wise. Speaking it and understanding it from a native speaker, not as good. But reading it, I can certainly do a correction on a machine translation. Socialist Romania is controversial. It is, and for good reasons, Guy. The rule of Ceausescu is littered with revisionist mistakes. However, I think he's another one where if you take the time to research and understand the mistakes and him, I think we can understand what was going on in the people's democracies a little better. But I will come to that when I come to do the episode. Jenny, who says, good afternoon, and hello, good to have you here. Georgi says, I do not like the interviewer, but the Revolution Report has a good post on YouTube regarding Carlson's interview. Okay. Many oof moments for Tucker. Yeah, he looked a bit uncomfortable at times. I will come to the full details in a minute, though. Let's just get through this. We've got a comment in Cyrillic there, which I will not try to read, as my spoken Cyrillic is awful, even though I can just about get the letters now. Battle Cossack, who says, Buenas tardes. Kent, hello to you in Minneapolis. Tim Gray, good evening to you. Taisa Ivanova, hello to you. Good afternoon to Martin, who's listening at work. Best way to do it. Good evening, comrades, who says Red Star Betty, who's actually managed to catch this one almost live. Comrade Hello Hi is in East Anglia People's Republic. They're popping up all over the place. We'll be converting the historic counties of England, Scotland and Wales into People's Republics, whereby we will form in the end a union of Soviet socialist counties that will be ruled by Popular Front governments. Rob, who's also using this to help me decide whether the interview is worth my time. Well, way to pile the pressure on there, comrades. I better perform well tonight. The Otis, this is from Red Star Betty. We need to connect the DPRN to that of Durham, comrade. The Northeast is racing ahead in the declaration of Soviet statehood here. I admire the spirit. The rock solid. The rock-solid strikes of the Northumberland and Durham miners will be honoured in terms of their tradition. David Fenton, I see you don't read the Rumble comments. I do every now and again, but don't actually get many. Ah, right, you're on there. Okay. Yeah, I don't very rarely check Rumble. I am trying to find a way of unifying all the chats into one thing. So if you know an app whereby I can do that, do let me know. David Fenton says, I see good evening from Bangor, Gwynedd. How's the weather in Manchester? Wet, cold, miserable. You'll feel right at home. So you're coming over this way tomorrow. Comrade Hello Hi says, East Anglia, People's Republic Revolutionary People's Council. Bit wordy. You might want to go for something a bit more catchy than that. Wayne Table says, Putin can separate Lenin as a revolutionary and from Lenin as head of state. Putin's critique of Lenin organizing the USSR into nation states is sound. He's not wrong. It created needless pressure points. I totally disagree with you, but I'm sure we'll get into that. One could argue the Westphalian nation state is a bourgeois European construct. What was the point of formal borders? Well... Okay, that's an even bigger question. Can be gotten into if necessary. Putin's reference to increasing development to the rest of the world is like the sun rising. Get used to it. It was profound. Time to declare Socialist Republic of Wales then, comrades. Things are racing ahead here. There is an argument for our Glossopian comrades to be granted auto-determination to join the PRHL. Right, so we're now getting to the point where Glossop, a town near where I grew up, is... declaring for some sort of self-determination, says Lurtis. This is turning into an interesting evening. We are planning the revolution in England and Wales via the live chat. Any Scots in here, feel free to jump in. We may need to unify. We need to set a a 5-year plan for each county, but unified in a national 5-year plan. Everybody get working on that from tomorrow. I will consult the Scousers when I get over there tomorrow so that historic Lancashire can get ahead of the game. So, right, we are now ready to go. And I will start with just saying, when considering the point regarding like how to regard the Putin interview, what I had to do when thinking about it was to separate out my reaction to it as a communist viewing it critically, and what Putin, the statesman, was clearly trying to achieve by giving it. And so you have to look at it from the objectives that he and his team will have set for this interview. And so let's first of all look at that. Now, as it has been commented upon, including by Carlson himself, Putin started the interview by going on a lengthy digression into all the way back into the 8th century, or I should say the 9th century, and what he claims is the foundation of the Russian state. So that the ancient and the modern history we will touch on a little bit tonight, but I am going to be recording a discussion specifically on that point with our comrade Slava, who's, of course, born and brought up in Ukraine, now currently resident in the United States. And, of course, she's spoken about Ukrainian history before and been on the program before. But we're going to be recording a special program to look at the Putin version of history and the version of history that is more real, because the Russian ruling group and the Russian nationalists at the moment have their version of history, which doesn't always accord with reality. Let's just say that. So we're going to be focusing tonight on the political side of things. The historical, which of course linked to it, will be touched on, but come back on Tuesday of next week for a more thorough discussion of that. So let's return to what Putin himself would have wanted to achieve from this. He would have aimed in this, and you could tell he was talking principally, but not exclusively, to an American audience, is to, of course, undercut the propaganda that has been circulated over the last, well, not just 2 years, really, but 20 years about him and about Russia. And he does this in various different ways. He does it by, of course, very calmly but persistently walking through the history of the Russian Federation since its formation, with the deliberate collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said something very interesting about that, which I will return to. And pointing out over and over again to this American audience, and apparently the videos had 20 million hits already, the video of the interview. So a lot of Americans have watched this. Although, of course, it's not exclusively Americans watching it, but I think a lot of those views will come from the United States. So he points out, he takes his history, in terms of the relationship with the United States, from Clinton through to Bush through to, he doesn't mention Obama by name. He mentions Trump, and of course he was asked about Biden. But the point he makes there is the point that I have seen him make before, and he made actually back in 2016-17 in the 3-hour-long programs that the interviews he gave to the film director Oliver Stone, which, if you haven't watched those, go away and watch them. It's a very insightful piece of work from Stone, and he gets an interesting insight or two from Putin. But Putin said the same thing then, which is that essentially that the presidents of the United States change, but the policy towards Russia never does. And he made the point very well, I thought, that the Russian Federation has sought, since the very earliest days, and he mentioned Yeltsin going to Congress and saying "God bless America" in what I regard as a hideous and sick-making act of comprador bullshit, but again, he mentions it for his own reasons. And he makes the point about the relationship with the United States that it was the Russian leadership, and he's not said this before, that initiated the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, previously, he has said variations of this, but he's never been as specific. He said in a speech given, I believe, in November 2022, there which I was watching, that the Soviet Union was collapsed illegally by party leaders who had no right to do it. Now, though, he is talking specifically about the Yeltsin role in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he's doing this quite deliberately. He's saying, look, the Russian leadership collapsed the Soviet Union, and they instigated it. And again, he's not said that before. The KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, they've made the point over and over again in a lot of their articles that are published on their a site that's linked to them, the Sovros site. They make the point that Yeltsin was the biggest separatist of all, which is true. He was, and Putin actually reflects that in this. He does so for reasons of demonstrating a point to his American audience. So it's interesting that Putin finally admits the reality, which is that the reason why the Soviet Union was collapsed, it was collapsed at the instigation of Yeltsin, and what I would describe quite accurately as a comprador clique around him. And he gives a fairly honest reflection in the interview with Carlson as to why they collapsed it, and also what they were looking to get out of it, aside from the oligarchs looting the state economy, of course. And he says that when Yeltsin went to the United States, what they expected was, and he says it quite openly, he's like, we're as bourgeois as you now, which is an interesting way of putting it. He doesn't say capitalist. There's no competition anymore. There's no ideological competition. And that's interesting, because that's not a line that Putin invented himself. That's a line from Gorbachev. If you go back and you read Gorbachev's execrable book, Perestroika, which I found in a bargain bin at a second-hand bookshop, the passages where he deals with wanting to end the Cold War in there, well, all of that is reflected in what Putin said today, though Putin is now reflecting upon it almost 40 years later with a great degree of bitterness. Because what Gorbachev says in Perestroika, along with, of course, making a similar claim to Putin about the 1,000-year history of the Russian state, of which, tune in for more about that next week, Gorbachev addresses the American audience, who he wrote the book for, by the way. He was a big hit in the United States and in Britain because, the Soviet leader declares in print that he's in effect ready to surrender. So what Gorbachev said in Perestroika, and this is back in '86, was that he wanted to end what he called the ideological competition between the United States and the USSR. And even more disgracefully than that, of course, because, of course, he's misrepresenting what the Cold War was about, but I'll come back to that. He also said that the Soviet leadership was prepared to concede the spheres of interest that were due to the British and the French in Africa and to the United States in South America. Now, what does that mean? It meant that Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership at the time were prepared to completely abandon any assistance to all anti-imperialist movements in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. Anywhere where the imperialists laid any claim, he was prepared to abandon any assistance to anti-imperialist forces. And that, of course, represents what? That represents the comprador group that were emerging, using Gorbachev as their shield until he was no longer of any use to them. And they discarded him and picked up, of course, the drunk, fool, egomaniac Yeltsin. But that's a very significant starting point for our analysis here, that Putin is picking up on, that he's reflecting the point of view that was first expressed properly and fully by Gorbachev. See, prior to Gorbachev, going back to Khrushchev, that group that was prepared to capitulate and sell out on the international revolutions, on anti-imperialism, had always been there, but they were held in check by a more revolutionary wing, which is why Khrushchev went from one thing to the other. He went from trying to reconcile with US imperialism at one point to swinging back and then backing the Cuban Revolution the next. It wasn't that Khrushchev was just a sort of capricious figure prone to wild mood swings. That's how he's portrayed. But no, it reflected, of course, the situation within the CPSU and the various different factions that were battling for influence within the party. And Khrushchev, as General Secretary, had to reflect these points of view, and in the end came to a point where a coalition was formed against him and he was removed. But, of course, Gorbachev comes in 30 years after Khrushchev, and you have a much more developed pro-capitalist wing, and also it's not just a pro-capitalist wing, it's a completely comprador wing. And herein we get to the points Putin was making about Russian relations with the United States. When Putin says that the Russians expected that they had declared themselves to be capitalists now, that ideological competition was over. Again, he's reflecting the Gorbachev point of view, which is completely idealist, which is that it was just about the fact that there was the US and the USSR represented rival ideologies. That's not correct. What they represent is, even up to the bitter end, different modes of production. Even up to 1989, when Gorbachev signed into law the law on socialist enterprises, which was a privatization law, and removed the restrictions on moving capital out of the country, thus allowing the open emergence of the oligarch caste and allowing them to steal gigantic amounts of money and take it out of the USSR and dump it in London banks. Up to 1989, USSR was still a largely socialist mode of production. That's a conclusion that I've come to following an awful lot of reading on the subject. The point is that it wasn't ideological competition. It was two different modes of production. It was the relentless pressure upon the USSR was, of course, a reflection of the fact that it represents, even after the Khrushchev period, a socialist society, albeit one that had problems, albeit one that's imperfect. But then again, who the fuck said we would get utopia overnight? Whoever believed that other than Trotsky? So, when it's characterized by Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Putin as ideological competition, that's incorrect. I think Putin knows it's incorrect, but again, Putin in many ways has to be regarded the same way as you would regard a Soviet general secretary or a Chinese general secretary, which is he is the head of a ruling group that contains many different factions, and he is basically, as the chairman of that ruling group, reflecting the consensus, the evolving consensus within that particular ruling group. All the factions within it, he balances them out and basically tries to embody in what he says and his public contributions the agreed line of the United Russia group, shall we say. And that's why when you're reading something that Putin has said, it's not just something that he's pulled off the top of his head. It's the considered opinion and consensus of the ruling group in the Kremlin and the wider United Russia group. And again, you have to read what Putin says in the same way you would read what Xi Jinping says. Obviously these men's opinions are important, but they represent a certain force, ruling force within that society. I mean, the Xi Jinping is the Communist Party, and that makes it a little easier to understand. But in many ways, the ruling group in Russia are all came up and were trained under the Brezhnev era, and they still behave essentially, even though their language has changed and the mode of production has changed, they still sort of behave like Brezhnevite cadre, which is that they decide a line and then they enact the line in a disciplined fashion. And whether they like it or not, they are still a reflection of the political training that all of them had growing up in the Soviet Union. Doesn't mean that Putin's going to snap his fingers and go back to Marxist-Leninism. What it means is that the political training and education that not just him, but Medvedev, Narishkin, Shoigu, all the others, all came up under that system, and they've organized the new system to reflect many of the aspects of what they came up under. The same is true for Lukashenko in Belarus. Lukashenko admitted in an interview he gave to an exiled Ukrainian journalist last year that he bases a lot of what he does on his experiences of growing up with the Marxist-Leninist system. Again, he's not a communist. I don't think he would describe himself that way. But he has said that, well, what he does is heavily influenced by his experiences growing up as in the communist system and as a young collective farm manager. So all of these men do have come to recognize that there are certain strengths in their political training as the younger men who came up under it. So going back to the point about the end of the Cold War and the declaration of Russia as a capitalist country. And Putin says, well, what the Russian leadership expected, and he's talking about the Yeltsin leadership, was that, well, the competition is now over and that Russia would be invited to take its place within an order that is led by the United States. And this is a crucial thing to actually say for him to address, because this is an honest reflection of the way in which the Russian compradors of the 1990s viewed things. They thought, well, we've destroyed communism. We've declared ourselves to be bourgeois. The way in which things go now is that we will be rewarded for our act of destruction and treachery by being invited into the capitalist world order. Remember when they used to include Russia in the G7 plus one? It's that kind of thing. That was what they were looking for. They were looking to join the top table. Again, this goes back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev said, if we give up basically any attempt at aiding revolutionary processes all over the world, will you essentially allow us, stop putting pressure on us and allow us to rule our bit of the world, and we will contribute towards an international order which is basically led by you. And they expected, foolishly, to be rewarded. And so you can tell the big turning point, because Putin keeps coming back to it, was the fact that the US launched the war against Yugoslavia, and Putin tried to defend Yeltsin in this part of the interview, and I find that very unconvincing. He said, "Oh, they condemned Yeltsin as a drunk." Yeltsin was a drunk. Yeltsin was drunk on camera over and over again. So a bit of disingenuousness from Putin there. But what is true is that the swing inside the ruling factions the pressure within the ruling factions got so intense during the American bombing of Yugoslavia that when Yeltsin sold out Milosevic, which he did, by the way, Putin doesn't mention that. One of the reasons why Milosevic had to give up was because essentially Yeltsin stabbed him in the back and sold him out to the Americans. But then Yeltsin lost control of the Russian military, who then raced to Pristina airfield, and we nearly got World War III thanks to the overreaction of General Wesley Clark. Only thanks to the actions of a certain Captain James Blunt that the day was saved. Google that and you'll find out what it means. So the way in which the change happened obviously is remembered very sharply inside the ruling group in the Kremlin, and they clearly bear a large grudge towards the United States. They should also bear a large grudge to Yeltsin, by the way, who could have aided the Yugoslavs and helped to end that war on negative terms for NATO. But of course, Yeltsin and the compradors who ran the Kremlin were still desperate to be accepted into the US-led order. And that was the dominant thinking still in the Kremlin after Putin comes to power in later 1999. Yeltsin's betrayal of Milosevic and the Yugoslavs helps to finish him off, and he's deposed because he no longer controls the military. That's why he goes, essentially. And Putin can't really control the military fully for a good couple of years after he first comes to power either. He has to overrule them when he aids the US occupation of Afghanistan in 2001. But this is the point that we want to get to here. And it's the same point that Putin made in his speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And essentially, 20 years on from Gorbachev, he went and made the same contribution to the debate, which is he says, we've done away with communism, true. Now, what we want is for you to accept us into your, we're prepared to accept that the United States is the leading power in the global order, but you have to respect our interests. And what he means by that is you have to stop interfering in Russia. And he covered that. He mentioned, of course, as he did in the interview with Oliver Stone, the fact that the CIA and MI6 were openly aiding the Chechen rebels. And he mentions that he got a note back from the CIA saying, yeah, we aid the Russian opposition. It's in our interest to do so. Which is actually a remarkably honest expression of policy there. But he said he's going through all these points that he makes with regard to the relationship with the United States. And he's saying, well, we kept trying at every stage to collaborate with you. And he mentions, of course, the George W. Bush era National Missile Defense Program, which, for those who don't recall, was a controversial attempt to build this anti-ballistic missile system in the US. There was going to be installations that governed its usage in England as well. And it caused a stink at the time because, of course, it violated the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the American imperialists just walked out of. And Putin says in this interview, and he's telling the truth about this, that he offered to collaborate with them. And they said, well, if it's a missile defense shield that's aimed against Iran, then, well, let us cooperate with you. And he said that initially George W. Bush said yes, and then Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates came to Moscow and said, well, no. Just as he covered earlier on in the interview, slightly earlier, that he said to Clinton, well, maybe we should join NATO. And they meant it at the time. They were prepared to join NATO. Again, they were prepared to allow the US to continue its rampage around the world, as long as the interests of the comprador bourgeoisie in the former Soviet bloc would be respected. And by that also means that what the post-Soviet Russian bourgeois wanted was to have an economic zone that consisted of most of the former Soviet countries. So Belarus being one, Ukraine being another, and Belarus, of course, has the Union State Treaty. Similar things were talked about with Ukraine, but of course Kushma played both sides repeatedly. Yushchenko wasn't going to have anything to do with that, him being a puppet of the United States. Yanukovych was interested, but never in a political position to be able to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Putin reflected at one point that, well, Yanukovych maybe isn't a very good politician, but maybe I shouldn't comment on that, even though he just did. But the point is that he's being quite open about what the Russian bourgeois wanted, which is that they wanted to be able to essentially operate as a supplier of raw materials to the West, mainly oil and gas, and also to be able to carry out an extensive business relationship with the oligarchic elites that emerged in all of the post-Soviet countries. So Belarus, being a slightly different case, being run on slightly different lines than a place like Kazakhstan, for instance. Ukraine, the Central Asian countries, and these would be the countries that made up the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. And as long as they could continue to do business with each other, and as long as the different oligarchies of like Ukraine and Russia were making money from the trade with each other, because remember, Ukrainian oligarchs did have extensive interests in Russia for a long time, and some Russian oligarchs had extensive interests in Ukraine and in the other former Soviet countries. As long as these interests weren't impinged on, then the Russian bourgeois had no interest whatsoever in challenging US hegemony. And that's an honest reflection of where things stood. Of course, Putin didn't put it exactly like that, but that's what the point of view was. And so, being faithful to that consensus, Putin, for a long time, of course, seeks accommodation. And this, of course, he's describing the turning point, which is in 2008, which isn't just related to the Georgia war. It's also related to the fact that that's when the NATO countries said they were opening the doors to Ukraine and Georgia. And Putin is, in rather scathing terms, refers to the European leaders who said that they were pressured by George W. Bush into agreeing to that, even though they didn't want it. And Putin just sort of contemptuously dismisses them and says, oh, well, you didn't agree to it, and now you say you oppose it, but what's to stop them pressuring you again? And of course, I think Putin does understand why the European leaders are so weak and pathetic, but there's not a consensus clearly within the Russian ruling group to on this. But as we've covered here on this channel many times before, the reason why the Germans and the French bend the knee constantly to the United States is because they've been bound to US imperialism for many, many decades, but also the dreams that they had of an independent Europe playing its own role in world affairs have all gone by the way. And I think Putin knows that. Whether other key members of the Russian ruling group know that, I don't know. I think Medvedev probably knows that. But he gets on to, of course, the run up to the war in Ukraine. But now we are at a point where he basically says that none of this would have happened if not for the coup in 2014, and he's largely right. Because he says, well, the US staged a coup in 2003 with the so-called Orange Revolution, but he says, well, we just did a deal with we did deals with Yushchenko and things carried on, because again at that point the Yushchenko group weren't as radical, I don't think. There weren't as much of a group of radical reactionaries in the driving seat. Yushchenko himself proved to be a rather ineffective figure. The Russians fairly easily dealt with him, and there was no eruption of civil war in the country. So when they tried again 10 years later, Yushchenko proved to be very unsatisfactory for the US imperialists. So when they tried again in 2014, they made sure that not only it wasn't a case of just inheriting the office of the president through an election that looked constitutional, but in actual fact, as Putin rightly pointed out, wasn't. They made sure that they thoroughly destroyed the old Ukrainian constitution and put in place one that was literally voted in via essentially an armed insurrection by groups that are a minority within Ukrainian society, the fascist organizations, and that the new Maidan regime will be built on the power of fascist armed bands from day one. And of course, again, the Russian ruling class had no real interest in getting into a war in Ukraine, but of course the uprising in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk, forced the ruling group in the Kremlin to reevaluate things. And as Putin said, he tried, or the Russian government tried, over and over again to reach any kind of accommodation they could with the ruling group in Kiev, Minsk I and Minsk II. But even the Istanbul negotiations, which were where he was prepared, the Russian government that is, were prepared to settle for very minimalist outcomes. And Putin reiterates that again, the independence being recognized of Donetsk and Lugansk, the fact that Crimea was always going to be Russian, and that would be it. And again, we've covered this many times before, but he then said, Carlson then asks him, well, why did Boris Johnson come in and persuade Zelensky to junk the agreement? And Putin says, well, you'd have to ask him. But I think Putin knows very well why that is. But he specifically avoids, I think for his own point of view, quite good reasons, accusing the US of being an imperialist power. What he says is, he says it in not so many words. He says that the US presidents change, but the policy doesn't change. That every US president he's dealt with starts off by saying, well, maybe we could have an arrangement, and then ends up being relentlessly hostile. So what he's doing is he's sort of playing into existing US narratives that exist, particularly within pro-Trump what would be described as right-wing or conservative circles about, the deep state and stuff like that. But what he's actually describing is US imperialism. What he's actually describing is that US imperialism is a system, and Putin and his closest collaborators have come to discover this to their own cost, is a system which can't be appeased. And Carlson asks him at certain points like, well, why do you think this is? Why do you think that they're so hostile? And Putin repeats various things about, well, they don't want a strong Russia. But of course, he doesn't spell it out as to why that is. And of course, the reason why they have never changed their policy towards Russia goes all the way back to the point in 1992 when Paul Wolfowitz and others wrote that famous memorandum at the tail end of the George H.W. Bush administration, stating that no powerful nation should ever be allowed to emerge again on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And now was the time to make sure that no possible rival could emerge in the new century to overshadow the power of the United States. When this is the document which fully expresses and most honestly expresses what became the intellectual foundations for the project for the new American century. Now that's ascribed by many people to the villainous work of some neocons, but what it actually is an honest expression of the needs of US imperialism. US imperialism now needed to go on a rampage all the way around the world to conquer as many markets, natural resources, and sources of exploitable labor as it possibly could in order to capitalize on the fact that the socialist bloc had disappeared. And again, like, this was what the Russians discovered, or what the ruling group in the Kremlin was forced to reckon with finally, was that, they're not going to stop. Like, no matter how many times we would try and reach an accommodation with them, even to the point of like where under the Medvedev presidency they essentially sold out Gaddafi, which they did, by the way. They knew very well what the US was going to do, but they allowed that resolution to go through anyway without opposing it. And that was another attempt at keeping relations good with Obama. Again, Obama rewarded them by going after one of their closer allies, the Syrians, and of course by continually trying to organize color revolutions against Putin anyway. And of course, the color revolutions attempts in the Russian Federation have never stopped from the moment that Putin came to power, be it funding the Chechen terrorist organizations, which of course were the ones who killed Kadyrov's father, and then of course also funding the various, or working with people like Khodorkovsky and his plans to become president and be the comprador ruler that the US was looking for, and the various attempts to make sure that Putin didn't return to the presidency in 2012. We could go on and on and on and on and on, but the hostility has, of course, been relentless. But it took 12 to 13 years of this relentless hostility and all the concessions that the Russian ruling group made and all of the attempts to essentially reach some lasting accommodation with the United States all just went down the shit pan. And of course the question is why, and the answer comes back that no American president, no matter what intentions he may have had, is allowed by the very nature of US imperialism to reaching a lasting accommodation with either Russia or China. See, even China, which was given the most favored nation status by Clinton and others, has faced relentless hostility from the United States, undercover hostility quite a lot of the time, going all the way back to Tiananmen Square in 1989, where they essentially tried to carry through a color revolution there. But then going more up to date, which is where in the beginning of the Xi Jinping period, one of the reasons why the Chinese party had to sharpen its act up very quickly was because they discovered that through various corrupt officials, the CIA and MI6 had got people all over the party and the state. And what's been going on over the last 10 years in the Chinese party and state has essentially been one ongoing purge of corrupt officials. And they've also, the CIA has complained that the Chinese whacked all of their intelligence assets very, very quickly. So the Chinese and the Russians have discovered through painful encounters that there's no deal to be made with the United States. The United States under its current setup isn't going to come to its senses and behave rationally. Now, what Putin's doing by spelling all of this out in very plain terms, and of course he throws in his usual anti-communist stuff in there, and I will come back to somebody raised the point about the Soviet national republic questions before. I think it was Wayne, so I will come back to that point. He throws in the fact that, as somebody else said in the chat, that, oh, we're more anti-communist than you, we did away with communism. I think he throws that in there basically to appeal to an anti-communist American domestic audience, essentially, as I think that was Todd who made that point in the chat. Yeah, that's true. That's what he's doing. He's aiming principally towards the Trump base. Putin's advisors are probably very well aware of the political divisions in the bourgeois political system of the United States, and so they've decided to try and make an appeal to the MAGA crowd. And that, of course, is why Putin mentioned the national debt of the United States and the border and the weaponization of the dollar. The border and the debt are two things that do resonate with the Trump base especially, and so he's making the point to them, believing with good reason that Trump is by far and away the leader of the pack when it comes to the election later on this year, and that by making an appeal to his base, essentially he sets up the ground to at least have a chance of having some sort of dialogue that will at least bring the war to a close. And of course, Carlson asked him, well, did you speak to Biden? And Putin just almost looked contemptuous and said, well, I can't remember the last time I spoke to him. And to be fair, Biden probably can't remember either. But then again, Biden can't remember what he had for breakfast this morning. So not exactly a high standard that we're setting there. And of course, there's no point in Putin talking to Biden unless Putin makes the point, and he got quite irritated at that point. Putin got quite irritated at various different points. I thought that was quite interesting. Not like angry, but just like he couldn't quite believe that Carlson was asking him a question that's stupid. But what he said was quite interesting. He said, well, what should I say to him? Should I start begging him? Should I show that I'm afraid? Well, yeah, that's what Biden would be looking for, ideally. Oh, please stop sending weapons, start begging? No. So clearly the consensus has been reached within the Kremlin that there's going to be no negotiation with the Americans either. He said, Putin did over and over again, that he's ready to settle it via negotiations with Zelensky. And he says, well, Zelensky should have the power to do that. But of course, Putin is very well aware that Zelensky doesn't have the power to do that because he's not in control of the situation. He's not in control of the Ukrainian state. To pretend that he is a farce. He doesn't have the financial base to be in control of the Ukrainian state. He can appoint Syrskyi over Zaluzhny to be the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, but it doesn't mean anything because the Ukrainian armed forces are entirely supplied and controlled now by NATO officers. Syrskyi is just the guy that they slap his image on the front of the tin, so to speak. Whereas the whole thing is built and designed now by principally American, British, German and French officers, 4 nations that haven't won a war in decades. So great experience that they bring to the table. So I will now return to the standard anti-communist stuff that comes in Putin's interviews. And I was expecting it because he always does this. He's slightly less so now than in his earlier years. I think that comes from the changing view of the Soviet Union within the Russian population, and the fact that Stalin remains so popular, that the Soviet era remains so popular. But also because I think genuine changes inside the Russian ruling group, which is that, as Putin's reflecting in this interview, they all expected to get something for their collective collapse of the Soviet system, the collapse of the Soviet system that the Russian leadership themselves carried out, and they never got anything. They never got their interests respected. They were never invited into the American-led order. Not really, as Tony Blair said in a memo that WikiLeaks got hold of. Just pander to the Russians sometimes. Pretend that they're a great power, even though we know that they're not. Though in reality, it seems to be the other way around. Everyone should pretend that this is what the British are demanding now. You've got to pretend we're a great power, even though everybody knows we're not anymore. But the point about the nationality policy. He's made this point over and over again, but I think he contradicted himself. On the one hand, he will say, and he said this over and over, that Lenin made a mistake by constructing a republic, or a union of Soviet states that where people were allowed to opt out of it. On the other hand, he says later on, well, it was the Russians who took the lead in dismantling the Soviet Union. So are we then meant to conclude that, Yeltsin and co were acting to prove Lenin's mistake, maybe? Because it was the biggest country that caused, by Putin's own admission now, the implosion of things. It wasn't Ukraine. Ukraine and Belarus under Shevchevich and Kravchuk went along with Yeltsin, but it was Yeltsin, Gaidar and the others' idea. So the biggest secessionist of all was Putin's old boss, who he was still defending in that interview to a certain extent. It was Yeltsin himself. So to go back to the nationality policy, though, because this is an important point. If we go along with the point of view put forward by Putin, and which Wayne has put forward in the chat here, if there had been no right to secede, or if it had been a more centralized union where Ukraine, Belarus, and all the others weren't SSRs in their own right, but it was more reflective of a sort of socialist version of the Tsarist Empire, basically, which is a more centralized state without the heavy degrees of autonomy, then would that have prevented the imperialists finding points of pressure? The answer is no, it would not. The various different petty bourgeois nationalist organizations that were collaborators with the Nazis would have emerged in the same way anyway in the Great Patriotic War, and would have acted in exactly the same way. The other point is that the republics, in terms of their growth of petty bourgeois nationalism, including in Russia, this all happened due to the regrowth of capitalist relations in Russia post 1956, whereas it was still, I would argue, a socialist system, but the bourgeois elements had been progressively introduced into it post-Khrushchev, or I should say post-Stalin, and that included some very, frankly, piss-poor experiments in pandering to nationalism by the Brezhnev leadership, which enabled a domestic petty bourgeois nationalist tendency to emerge, especially in the intelligentsia. Ironically, all these poets and nationalist writers in places like Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, none of them would have had a job except for if it hadn't have been for the rather generous way in which the Soviet state treated its intellectuals. There you go. Never trust a poet. But if we take it in the other direction and what Putin's point of view is, that there would have been unitary authority, how would that have prevented the scheming of the imperialists exactly? How would it have prevented the regrowth of petty bourgeois nationalism in Ukraine, Belarus to an extent, even though it's never fully manifested there, thankfully, but Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, etc., the Baltic states? How would that have actually prevented the schemes of the imperialists who are using the exiled Foreign Legion of fascists to try and run sabotage operations in there, and then when Gorbachev just let all the barriers down and let them all back in, of running riot in those places and trying to take over the government? How would that have prevented that? There would still have been a regional government. It just wouldn't have been called its own SSR. It wouldn't have been basically treated as a country within a federation. It would have been treated as a region. But what would have prevented them from trying to take over those governments and declare independence from the USSR anyway? What would have prevented the imperialists for 70 plus years from making all these points about, the USSR is a prison house of nations, let them go, let them be free? How would that have changed the propaganda and the fact that people like Solzhenitsyn went over there and tried to prove them right? How would it have prevented the petty bourgeois nationalists stirring up problems between the Russian workforce that went there to develop the industries and the domestic peasantry and working class, which is what you got in places like Kazakhstan, where you had anti-Russian riots because people like the former Kazakh leadership in the 1980s deliberately stirred that up to enhance their own power. This is Nazarbayev and his clique. That's where they came from, stirring up anti-Russian sentiment. Would the fact that the republics would have become run in a unitary fashion from Moscow have prevented any of those tensions, or would they have actually made it worse? See, this argument that Putin puts forward just simply doesn't work, because it's viewing things in a purely administrative context. It's saying that, well, if we changed the constitution and we made it basically so that the Soviet Union wasn't a union of different nations coming together in brotherhood anymore, what it was essentially a unitary Russian-run state, but this time a socialist one, run from Moscow, and there weren't different republics, they were all unified around Moscow's rule. Well, that, if anything, would have made the ground upon which the petty bourgeois nationalism grew back, and the case made by the exiled fascists, even more potent. So I completely reject this argument. It is it's garbage, to be quite blunt. And I think we need to be very, very clear when we're talking about Putin and the ruling group in the Kremlin. And I've watched a hell of a lot of Putin's speeches and read a lot of his contributions over the last couple of years. And you have to respect the man as a very capable leader and manager of a system who has clearly great political skills and survival skills, given how long that he has been in office. But we must never, ever mistake his skills and also the genuinely progressive things that he has done. So, for instance, reducing the power of the oligarchs, that's something domestically that is genuinely progressive, and also reversing the Gorbachev policy to an extent over relationships with Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, the various countries in the Arab world that Putin has tried to build better relations with, but especially with regard to and also Nicaragua in Central America, and the various different countries that have opposed the United States, which the Russians have slowly built up relationships with, the role that the Russian Federation has played in the Sahel, for instance, in aiding those national liberation movements that have come to power through the revolutionary nationalist juntas there. All of those are progressive anti-imperialist measures which must be respected as such. However, they always view things critically. If you're any kind of Marxist, you have to view things in the whole. You can't just abstract the bits of Putin that you like and disconnect them from the whole. So let's examine the whole. And the whole still is that the tendencies within the Russian ruling group, yes, are less anti-communist now than they were 20 years ago. That is certainly true. There's more room now for communists to operate, I think, to a certain extent in Russia, but there's still repression of communists in Russia. Sergei Udaltsov of the Left Front, who is by no means some sort of pro-Western character. He's a backer of the special military operation. He works with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, who them and the Russian Communist Workers' Party were pushing for the military operation to save Donbass way before the ruling group in the Kremlin were, and way before United Russia were, because the Russian ruling class were prepared to let the Donbass rebellion die away. In their view, that was threatening. It was composed of people who were like old school Soviet patriots, various different forms of sort of left Russian nationalists, various different forms of communists. The Russian ruling class largely didn't want anything to do with that. So here we are. It was the communists, some of it, and the Russian Communist Workers' Party, who were pushing for that for years, and mad old Zhirinovsky as well, of course. But it was the Russian Marxists who were making the case that action needed to be taken to save what was in effect a working class rebellion in Donbass. And by the way, just to go back to the point about Putin makes about Donbass being transferred to Ukraine, Donbass was transferred to Ukraine by the Bolsheviks basically to put a solid proletarian heartland into Ukraine, which, although it had some elements of industry in it, didn't have as much as Russia did. It wasn't as developed. It was still overwhelmingly rural and peasant, Ukraine was, in the early 1920s. I'm sure perhaps Slava will be going into that when we speak on Tuesday. But they put the industrial Donbass in there to give it a proletarian heartland. That's why they did it. It wasn't to cheat the great Russian nation out of its birthright or anything like that. It was to manage the different nations properly. And as for Putin's complaints about the Soviet nationality policy, again, this is contradictory. Because on the one hand, he complains about it, and I've made this point many times, and I will make it again. On the one hand, he complains about it. He complains about what he calls Ukrainization. He complains about the Bolshevik or CPSU's promotion of Ukrainian culture. But on the other hand, he's retained that policy, and he was very careful when answering the question from Carlson about being a Christian nation. Have you noticed that? He was very careful about saying, well, yes, orthodoxy is very important here, but we respect all the languages and religious traditions. These all people are all Russians. He doesn't get that from Tsardom, even though he claimed that he did. The Tsardom was the opposite. The Tsardom, even though it tolerated Islam and Buddhism, and to a certain extent, it certainly didn't fucking tolerate Judaism. Just look back at the number of hideous pogroms that were launched by the Tsardom in places like Ukraine and Belarus and across the rest of Western Russia in the lead up to to World War One. And look at the pogroms, the white generals, the Tsarist generals, who, by the way, still have statues in some places in Russia that were put up during the Yeltsin and the early Putin period. The pogroms that they launched of the Jewish population, hideous, the worst pogroms until the Nazis came along. And by the way, some of those areas in Western Russia and Ukraine where the worst pogroms took place under the Tsar and under the white generals, were where the worst pogroms and mass killings of Jews took place under the Hitlerites as well. So it wasn't the great Russian tradition of toleration of all religions and cultures that Putin gets his nationality policy from, as in how he applies it to the different peoples that constitute the Russian nation. No, he took it straight from the Soviet Union. So he moans and complains about it on the one hand, but he upholds it on the other. I think he knows the truth of it, but what he's got is a situation where he has all these dull-witted Russian chauvinists that do exist inside the power centers of Russia. They're chronicled by people like Sakwa, in Richard Sakwa in his book, who talks about all the different tendencies within the Russian ruling group. And they are very much there, but they're sort of counterbalanced by others who are more pro the Soviet legacy. And again, Putin reflects that in what he says, which is why I found the last 45 minutes of the interview, to be honest, I found boring, where Carlson starts babbling on about God and souls and stuff like that. And you can tell, again, like, go back to the interview with Oliver Stone where Putin talks about why orthodoxy was embraced. Again, like, Putin might be a Christian, but he's not like a sort of professional Christian. When he talks to Stone about it, he says, well, communist ideology had gone. We needed something else. We took this. It's utilitarian. Putin's view of faith, like, he might go to church and, cross himself, etc., but it's a view that is strictly utilitarian. It's a practical view. The nation needs something to bind it together. This is a very long-standing institution in Russia. We adopted this. Whereas Carlson wants him to go into sort of Dugin-esque levels of end-of-the-world Christian mythology stuff. So that I found that to be interesting as well. But when he's talking about souls and AI and all that shit, it's like, Putin was right in his opening comment. Carlson's a fucking talk show host. He's like, I mean, credit to him for going out there and doing this interview, and it's certainly been an enormous scoop. But if I had to compare Carlson with anybody, I'd say perhaps the best comparison is that he's a latter-day David Frost, who was also a talk show host who interviewed a famous president, well, president in that case being Nixon, ex-president in that case. But overall, I thought Putin has achieved, I think, what the objectives he would have set himself to achieve, when he's talking to principally an American audience, and also I think talking to certain European audiences as well. He's achieved a mass audience and has overcome the US and European attempt to censor him and to get him off the air, basically. And you can see all the bourgeois press frantically scrambling around the place today, saying, "Oh my God, which bit of the Putin interview was the maddest?" You watch the whole thing. I mean, I've just spent quite a considerable amount of time criticizing Putin, and I do regularly. But you watch 2 hours of that, you can't say that that man is mad. There's no way that you can honestly say that. Even if you hate him, you can't say that he's mad. He's a calm, almost cold-blooded, rational man who manages to speak for quite extemporaneously, I'm sure he prepares well, for long periods of time, recalling at great levels of detail, often details I don't agree with, but great levels of detail nonetheless, and explaining things in a calm but insistent fashion. He doesn't let Carlson talk over him. He always finishes his point, and he always does so very calmly. He's completely in charge of the situation. He's a man who's obviously completely in charge of himself. You compare that to, like, Biden. Oh, my God, I'll compare it to any of the US presidents in recent years. I think the last US president who could have sat down and given a 2-hour interview, well, Clinton could probably have done it, but it would have all been lies and would have been shallow, waffling nonsense. George H.W. Bush could have done it, but would have been more skillfully put together and more boring lies. The last one who could have probably done it and it would have been interesting was probably Nixon. Because Nixon was probably the last one who had an intellect that was truly worthy of respect. Complete bastard, scumbag, but I think that Nixon was probably the last truly intelligent man who was president of the United States. I think George H.W. Bush was an intelligent man, but not as much as Nixon. That's just my personal reflection. All right, so let's now go back through the various comments. Where did we get to? Right. I hope that I've convinced Rob and Beans to watch the interview, because there's no reason that I should suffer through Tucker Carlson alone. Right, where are we now? Okay, Videos del Mundo says, have you read the book Liverpool Dockers, Great Labour History? Written about the Liverpool dock life. I haven't read it. I have read other things about Liverpool dockers, though. I've been to the bar in Liverpool that various of them set up after the dock strike in the 90s as well. But I will make a note of the book that you suggest there. Mike Swan, who's in Kent. Good evening to you, comrade. Wayne Table says, I laughed out loud when Putin said it started in 800 AD. Yeah, you had to say that was some good trolling. Where are we now? Slava says, from reading Russian Communists' post this morning, I can see they are not happy about Putin's statements on Lenin or Stalin. Yeah, and also not happy about Putin's rather frank admission that it was the Russian leaders who deliberately dissolved the Soviet Union. I mean, I'm sure all the Russian communists knew that, but yeah, that's not gone down well domestically at all. Okay, where are we now? Wayne says, little bits of dialectical materialism comes through every now and then when Putin speaks at length. Yep, you can't escape your origins no matter how hard you try. Gordon says, this interview was awful, smiley face. No new information. Didn't answer the two questions. Evasive responses. Historical redundancy. No historical relevance. Relevance. Defamed communism. Was brutal. Well, I think I've already answered most of that. I mean, if you want to expand on that, feel free to do so. I think he did answer certain questions. I think his account of how the Ukraine war began was truthful. I think he's almost completely accurate about that. And I can disagree with the fact that it did happen, and I can disagree. I can disagree with the fact that that Putin spent so much time trying to sign agreements with people who would never go and agree with him, and the point of view that the Russian ruling class had, going all the way back to their earliest stages as a a breakaway faction within the Communist Party hierarchy. But in terms of his description of the actions of the US imperialists, he was telling the truth. They even tried to involve Putin in the World Economic Forum, as far as I remember. Yeah, you're right, he did go there a couple of times. Tell you who else went there? Gennady Zyuganov. Gennady Zyuganov went to the World Economic Forum meeting. It was either 95 or 96. I think it must have been 95. No, it would have been early 96. I looked this up, and he went to basically give reassurances to international capital that he wasn't going to put the planned economy back in place, that he was going to move to social democracy, which is, by the way, what everybody was promising the People's Democracy populations and the former Soviet countries, that it was going to be not hardline, ultra-reactionary capitalism, but they were going to have their wonderful merged world of social democracy. And that's what the Russian communist platform of 1996 was. It was a social democratic platform. So Zyuganov was there in 96 to promise them that he wouldn't interfere with the restoration of capitalism, that it would just be the social democracy that the Russians thought they were getting, he was going to bring them. Interesting point. Didn't do him any good. They still rigged it against him. Capitalist fools make me mad, says Klavek. Quite right too. I know many Russians do hold that grudge, and quite right too. That's from Jenny. This was the moment of the MI6 blunder in Moscow, says Lertis. Hello to Tusker, who's starting the stream and catching up. Wayne says this interview would never have happened, or never have been permitted to happen 2 years ago. Western Intel would have sabotaged it. Now most of the damage has already been done, and the stakes are lower. Yeah, when they thought they were going to win, I don't think that this would have gone on the air. I think that the imperialists now know that it's over. They just don't want to admit it, and Biden might be over as well. So if they ditch Biden, maybe that's a sign that they're going to bring this thing to a close. But I don't think it's going to come to a close. I think they're going to carry this on for as long as they possibly can. Leotis mentions the famous Obama reboot. Quite correct. Remember Hillary Clinton presenting Lavrov with a misspelt reset button? But that also was just another color revolution plot, because they thought that they could use Medvedev to displace Putin permanently. How wrong they were. Read Obama's autobiography, by the way, about that. His first memoir over the first term of his presidency, when he's describing how he tried to bond with Medvedev. It's hilarious. Biden can't remember the last time he pissed in the toilet. Saves time when he just does it in his pants. Wayne says, Tucker is a typical American with no knowledge of the world. In his post-interview assessment, Tucker personalized everything Putin said and portrayed Putin as feeling hurt and reacting emotionally. Yeah, Wayne's right about that. Like these American bourgeois types, even like Carlson, was like, oh, Putin was feeling angry. No, Putin got irritated with him a couple of times, mainly when Carlson said stupid things, which he did on numerous occasions. But Putin was generally his level-headed self. He just refused to play the game that Carlson wanted to play, which is Carlson reflecting the fact that he's a bourgeois journalist by profession, or a bourgeois talk show host by profession. And yes, he's got the scoop of a lifetime, but I would say I would like to have seen somebody more intelligent doing that interview, but I can't think of anybody who's come through the American bourgeois press who would have done it any better than Carlson did. I mean, I'm thinking of writing to the Kremlin asking to grant me an interview with Putin. I think that would be an interesting conversation. Not that it would ever happen. Putin wasn't having any Tucker's anti-China hysteria, though. Yeah, and that was a very good answer. Basically said, shut up, you're being stupid, to Carlson, who was trying to do well, don't you think that you'll be colonized by China? And Putin's like, no. Next question, idiot. Putin also praised the one family idea again, in contradiction to Lenin and Stalin and their policy of self-determination. Yeah, it's hard to conceive of a family, though, if we're talking back to the Soviet period, when the little father of all the Russias, in the form of the Tsardom, has been crushing all the small nationalities for millennia. You know? Hello to Log66, and hello to Tom, who apparently agreed with something I said a little while ago. Credit is due, but Carlson is the US version of David Frost, says Joe Anthony. Why don't I run for Prime Minister, asks Comrade Hello Hi. Well, will you get the People's Republic of East Anglia to organise the votes for me? That's the question. I mean, I'm pretty much sure that between me and the few Mancunians here and the Scousers, we can get the Northwest stitched up. But if you're prepared to do the work down in East Anglia, let me know. Besides, just to be more serious about your question, I wouldn't run for bourgeois office again with a gun to my head. I've done that before. It's a very unrewarding experience. There's no way that being Prime Minister of Britain would enable you to do anything positive. The only way you're going to be able to deal with the legacies of Britain is if the current British state is destroyed and a new one is built in its place. A proletarian state is built in its place. Thank you for your excellent analysis, Alex, says Klavik. Glad you're enjoying the programme. It sounds like it is worth making some time for it this weekend. I've got a pile of ironing to do, says Rob. Yeah, Tucker Carlson is good ironing television. Even if you know all the stuff that Putin's going to say, just enjoy the parts where he slaps Carlson. At one point, he melodramatically presents him with a file full of documents from the 13th century or something, which must have been a troll move. Like, Putin is, to be fair, he's quite a funny guy. He knows how to mock people, and it's clear that he knows Carlson's an airhead from minute one. He's basically just mocking him periodically. Log 66 says, I haven't ironed in 10 years myself. Well, lucky you. Carlson kept going on near the end about the young spy. I think Putin handled that well. Yeah, Putin said was it Gershkovich? He basically said that, well, we could do a prisoner swap, and suggested somebody in a German prison, I believe. Did you get the impression that he was taking jabs at Tucker for being in the CIA? Yeah. Basically, yeah. He kept taking jabs at him. I think Putin understands very well the kind of person that Carlson is. And he wasn't going to go in there and just allow him to sort of turn it into the talk show moment. He was using it for his own purposes, and to give credit where credit is due, he used it for his own purposes very well. Right. Wayne said, of all the famous bourgeois mainstream press people in America, who realistically could have handled something like that, I think Glenn Greenwald would have done the best interview with Putin. To be fair, yeah, that's probably true. I think Greenwald would have done better. I think he's got his own obsessions, though, which might have derailed it a little bit, but he's a much better interviewer. I'd have liked to have seen, Max Blumenthal do it. Max Blumenthal, I think, would have been an interesting candidate to do it. I don't think Putin would have agreed to do it, though, because he was looking for somebody who could open the door for him further into the Trump base. I think that's what he was looking for, and he got that. So it's a good selection from Putin's point of view. And I think the Trump base watching that is probably going to respond quite well to it. So again, Putin's political calculation, I think, has paid off quite well. Right, okay, so we are now on the 9 o'clock of the hour, and I need to get on with preparing myself for tomorrow. So I'll thank the 103 of you who are currently watching this live. I should jump on the back of Tucker Carlson interviews more often, it would seem. John Lemberger has asked, when do you do your Michael Hudson hit piece? Well, John, to answer your question, it's not going to be a hit piece because I respect some of what Hudson has done, but his central conceit regarding the way in which he portrays capitalism, and the transition to socialism is what I disagree with the most, and the way in which he characterizes U.S. imperialism as being being delivered via just dollar supremacy. So that will be coming. So thank you to everybody for tuning in. I will be back with you at the regular time of 10:30 tomorrow. If you think the 7:30 is a better time, then do let me know. I can adjust accordingly, or I can go back and forth between 10:30 to 7:30, as I've got that time free. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, and now it's time to return to some patriotic music.
Oh, Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet